Well, our next guest, Brandon Weichert, is going to give us a cracker of an interview because he's going to tell us whether we're going to head into serious escalation in the Middle East following a strike on Iran, possibly, and whether Iran in turn will escalate after that strike, which I've heard might happen as soon as the next few days. Brandon is a former congressional staff and geopolitical analyst who's a contributor to the Washington Times, the Asia Times, as well as an energy security analyst at the Pipeline. He's the author of Winning Space, How America Remains a Superpower, Biohack, China's Race to Control Life, and The Shadow War, Iran's Quest for Supremacy. His next book, A Disaster of Our Own Making, How the West Lost Ukraine, is due on October the 22nd from Encounter Books. He has been described as a panic and anxiety-inducing scholar who tells us things we don't want to hear but must know. He can be found on Twitter at @WWII. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So is the end of the world nigh? What's going to happen in the next week or so?
Well, sadly, I think we're in the phase that Abraham Lincoln described, where we have not controlled events, but must confess plainly that events are controlling us. And so it's really in the hands of what the Iranians and the Israelis and Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis all plan to do, and we'll have to just react because that's the world we're living in right now.
So give us some kind of timeline of what's not everyone is totally up to date on the news. What happened? What was the Israeli attack? And just give us some details of that attack on the consulate and what was going on, and then talk us through it.
Yeah,
talk us through events.
I'd like to just preface this because I found out a couple weeks ago a very interesting tidbit that I was not aware of before, which was basically that Hamas was planning. The Hamas plan for October 7th was actually far more comprehensive than it ended up being. They were planning to actually get those fighters much farther north. The fighters got distracted by that music festival because of all the pretty girls there. And so the original plan was to have them go much farther north. And when those fighters massed farther north, Hezbollah was supposed to come in from Lebanon and do a really big offensive against Israel. At the same time, the Syrian Arab army under Bashar al-Assad was supposed to open up another front against Israel. And it was, from what I was told, it was the Russians who told Assad, do not do it. And once the Syrians stood down, Hezbollah slowed their tempo down, and they kind of left Hamas in the lurch, forcing Iran to have the Houthis open up a new front, which was not the original plan. And so I'm saying this because what happened about a week and a half ago was Israel is, as you know, killing all of these Hamas and Hezbollah leaders. They're also trying to get as many Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps leaders as they can as part of this wider war in revenge for October 7th. And so they tracked one of the heads of the IRGC to the Syrian or the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria, and they decided we're going to knock this guy out. And so they blew up the embassy, and they did kill the target. But because it was sovereign Iranian territory and it was clearly meant as sort of a middle finger to Iran, the Iranians are threatening to retaliate massively now against Israel. But one other thing I'd like to add here, which is a little point that's not really brought up. We're all talking about the possible Iranian escalation. But what is important to note is after that event happened and after the Iranians threatened massive retaliation, the leadership of Iran did something funny. You know, we're supposed to believe they're these big, bad, military power, but the leadership of Iran called the Americans and pleaded with the Biden administration to get Israel to stand down in Gaza. And if they did that, the Iranians said, we won't go, postal. And so I think that actually indicates a high degree of weakness by Iran, because here Iran is beating their chests, and behind the scenes, they're actually trying to find a third way out because they've really locked themselves in diplomatically. But if they don't get an off-ramp, we are going to see a major escalation because they're going to have no choice, and that could lead to the Third World War that I've been worried about.
Do you think the Iranian threat or whatever begging to the Americans has kind of influenced some of the behavior of Biden now, critical towards more growing criticism of Israel? Yes. Could that possibly be perceived as enough for the Iranians to save face?
No, because I shouldn't say no. It could be if Israel follows through on a full stand down in Gaza. Israel is starting to pull back. They've pulled back the bulk of their divisions. They're pulling back from Gaza, I think they have. I think they only have a handful of divisions now forward deployed in Gaza. There does seem to be some degree of a drawdown in the south. The question is, though, will there be an escalation against Syria or against the Hezbollah in Lebanon? We don't know. But I do think that Bibi Netanyahu knew that Iranian phone call happened, which is why he's kind of preempting the Americans by pulling his forces slowly out of Gaza and taking a more defensive position.
Is Israel, because we in Europe, we're kind of quite pro-Palestinian. I'm not. I'm anti-immigration, but I'm quite critical of some of Israel acts. But does Israel listen to anyone? Does America have any leverage over Israel?
You know, the way I look at this is, America has a lot of leverage because we're giving them their weapons. The issue, though, is I look at this. I'm a nationalist and a populist at heart. And I believe Israel's a sovereign country. And if they think it's in their national interest to do what they're doing, then everybody else should butt out, just as we would expect other countries to leave us alone in America if we were responding to a perceived threat. That's just the way nation states work. And so I don't get as exercised about what Israel is doing. I just think this is really an internal Israeli matter. And I really don't want to have any greater role. I don't like it when we start in America dictating to other countries what they should do internally. And so I have a different take, I think, than most people, certainly in Europe, do on this issue.
But I mean, it's one thing if Israel does its business, but it's John Lewis Gaddis, who's an American Cold War historian, said alliances are transmission belts to war. And we see how World War One, the weakest guy of all, the Serbs, managed to get everyone else embroiled. And I think there's been a growing realization of this. We used to think that the giants of the Cold War, Russia, the Soviet Union, America, ran things, but basically they were often seemed sort of blackmailed by their weaker parties. There's this conflict in Berlin in 1961 where basically the guys running the show were the East Germans, and they were pushing and bullying the Soviets into confronting the Americans, which the Russians didn't want to do at all. And Cubans, exactly. And it's like right. A sort of irresponsible child, basically. We all know that scenario where they say, we're going to go in and you better just save us, and now we have Macron doing the same in Ukraine. So, I mean, if Israel escalates against Iran, will America be dragged in? And how can we avoid World War III?
Well, and this is why I wrote the book, because I was trying to warn people we were heading in the Middle East to World War III. The thing to remember is, a lot of people have problems with Israel in terms of their settlement policies, and I understand that's controversial, but October 7th really didn't happen because of those policies, the humanitarian concerns from people. It wasn't done because of that. Gaza was left mostly alone since 2005. They elected Hamas. Hamas then swore fealty in December 2016 to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, along with Hezbollah, which has long been an IRGC conduit, as well as the Islamic Jihad and Fatah in the West Bank. All of these groups in December of 2016 met with the now deceased General Qasem Soleimani and basically said they were going to pull their resources together and defer to Iranian leadership to initiate what they said would be the third and final intifada. And the reason October 7th happened when it did was because Netanyahu went to the UN 3 weeks prior and held up a map. And he said during his speech, it's the map of the new Middle East, and it showed how Israel was working to align its security interests with those of Saudi Arabia. And once the Iranians saw that, they saw that the Saudis and the Israelis were continuing the Abraham Accords that were started by Trump. They had to do something to stop that coalescence. And the Hamas attack initiated when it did because the Iranians told Hamas to do it, to break up that budding romance between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And of course, now we we've seen Saudi Arabia has divorcing itself from Israel, at least publicly. And what that means is the only way you get away from a world war in the Middle East is by getting Israel and Saudi Arabia, traditional U.S. allies, to take up the slack and secure the region and contain Iran while we step back. You don't do it by empowering Iran and sowing chaos by throwing our allies, as imperfect as they are, all over the side of the boat, which is what Biden is doing, which is actually going to, I think, create the world war that we're trying to avoid.
Right. So, but this alliance, this friendship, rekindling the friendship between Saudi and Israel is not is a medium term thing. What can we do? I mean, we're talking about days and weeks here to stop World War III, maybe.
There really is, like I said, it's going to be contingent on what the local parties do, and we're going to react to it. I suspect Joe Biden is, if Israel kind of goes gangbusters, I suspect the United States will not have Israel's back as it might have in previous generations. Personally, I think that's a tragedy. But I do think that if Israel goes gangbusters, or if Iran strikes Israel, there is a very real possibility that the Biden administration will do what they did in Afghanistan and hit the chicken switch.
Right. Okay. So Israel, of course, is a nuclear power. Is there any risk that, this? You've heard this Samson option. There's a guy called Martin Kreveld, who's a very well-connected Israeli historian. Says we're gonna, before we go down, we're gonna bring everyone down with us.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
That's very much. Yeah, basically, it's kind of like a Parthian shot in a way. It's basically exactly as you described it. If it looks like Israel's going down, they are going to unleash their nuclear arsenal on most of their neighbors as a big FU. And again, I can't really blame them if it's an existential war and they're going to lose. I understand the mentality. I hope they don't do it. I hope we don't get to that point. But yeah, if they are surrounded and everything is lost, rather than give up and, possibly risk, in their view, another Holocaust, they will just end everything in the region. Of course, that will escalate probably into a wider conflict because Iran is aligned with China and Russia. You've got other international concerns there. This is a really toxic brew, and you're right. The next few days are really good, or the next week is really going to be critical. And I have a hope that Iran is cowardly enough that they will not go over the edge just yet, because so far there have been 2 or 3 moments thus far where it looked like they would, and they pulled back because in many cases the Russians were telling them, don't you do it. And that's an unspoken story.
I'm often, I understand the Russia conflict. I follow Russian news quite a lot, and maybe in the West, everyone says, the Russians are intent on dominating the world. But actually, they seem to be a force of restraint in the Middle East, as you just said. Can't they be given credit for that?
Well, they won't be. And I certainly am not, I'm an American, so I really don't care about what other countries, but I will give credit where credit is due, which is that in the Middle East, at key moments, the Russians have worked as a quasi-stabilizing force. That's sort of the role that they've taken on for themselves. And it's actually, but might help us avoid this kind of nightmare scenario of World War III erupting in the Middle East.
Do you think there's the back channel communications between the Americans and the Russians to rein in their respective associates?
I can only pray, but I don't believe it's what it was during the Cold War, which is why I actually think whatever's going on between the U.S. and Russia now is far scarier than anything, except maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis, anything that happened in the Cold War.
Although
we're led by children. We're led by children.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're led by. I mean, you have Boy Wonder, Jake Sullivan, and you've got, Tony Blinken. The Biden administration is populated by naive ideologues who really hate the West, hate the United States, and they don't want to do business with the Russians because, the Russians supposedly stole the election for Trump or something in 2016. And that's what they're running with. And that's why you're seeing their really silly behavior and immature behavior toward a nuclear armed power like Russia.
Incredible. So what Why do you think the mainstream media in the West, I looked at the Washington Post and the New York Times and the BBC headlines, and it's all kind of business as usual type stuff. It's almost as if it's a little bit calmer than the previous months. And I'm reminded that like the day before World War I broke out, on 1st of August, 1914, the front page of the Times was the Henley Regatta or something, and the horse racing. And
yeah. Well, remember, they were calling the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand at that time the Third Balkan Crisis. So it was just sort of like another day. And so, I've said for very often, we are at the beginnings of World War III, and God help us, it's going to look a lot more like World War I than World War II. And as terrible as World War II was, World War II had a beginning, middle, and end, and it was decisive, and there were clear good guys and bad guys. World War I, that was not, none of that was the case.
Well, there's that joke or semi-joke. I don't know how World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Yeah.
Well, it's worrying. I think that what's that guy who made Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan, said, "I made it because I was on CND marches in London in the 1980s, but my children don't know what the nuclear weapons are." They said, "Oh, that old thing. It's not." So there's a younger generation that's not afraid of nuclear war. And I think our generation is. But it's certainly very worrying times. So we just got 2 minutes left. Could you tell us where we can find your work? And
I'm a national security reporter at the National Interest. You mentioned in the bio, you can find me also at the-pipeline.com. You can follow me at WeTheBrandon on Twitter, Truth Social, and Getter. And you can get my books wherever they're sold. Best chance would be Amazon. Look me up. I've got 4 books out now, or 3 books out with 1 on the way.
We actually got about a minute left. What are your other books about? And if you can summarize that in about a minute.
Yeah, Winning Space is the story of the formation of Space Force and how the U.S. needs a Space Force to deter Russia and China and Iran and North Korea from attacking us in a space Pearl Harbor. The other book, Biohacked, China's Race to Control Life, is all about how China is weaponizing the development of biotechnology to create what they call specific genetic attacks. COVID-19 was a bioweapon. And then my third book is The Shadow War on Iran. And my next book is how basically NATO expansion created the war in Ukraine today.
Right. Well, and that's coming out on the 22nd of October.
Yes, sir.
I've got to add a bit of black humor there. If there is a 22nd of October.
I've been saying this too. Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, Brandon Weichert, who's a brilliant national security analyst, who writes for the National Interest and is an expert on Iran. And he's been saying worrying things. Maybe you shouldn't be booking your summer holiday. No, seriously. Follow it with guarded pessimism, but don't go over the top, I would say, to our viewers. But certainly it is a worrying time ahead. Well, I'd like to thank you all for this afternoon's show and listening in. A wide variety of brilliant guests and analysts telling you how the world really looks. So this is the Pelineros Taylor Show, ending up on this Wednesday afternoon. Back tomorrow at the same time. Thank you very much, and we're off air now.